Hello once again, friends and enemies. Welcome back to Weird Deck Techs. My name is Toxy, and today's archetype that we're going to be looking at is an archetype from Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc V, used by Chojiro Tokumastu. The Flower Cardian archetype is an archetype whose cards have art that heavily resemble Hanafuda cards, which are a type of Japanese playing cards. The Flower Cardian's big deal is both drawing cards and special summoning more cards so that you can draw more cards. It's a very monster-heavy archetype. In fact, when building a Flower Cardian deck, most of your deck is most likely going to be monster cards, with just a few of the supporting spell cards to help you get more cards, either into your hand or out onto the field. That being said, let's go ahead, take a look at the archetype, and see how we feel about it. So here we have my pure Flower Cardian deck build, and if you haven't been here before, let me tell you how it works. I'm going to go over all of the cards in the deck, tell you how they work and what they do. We'll take a look at some gameplay, and then I'll talk about my thoughts on the archetype and on the deck. So let's get into it. 3 copies of Flower Cardian Polonia. While you control a level 11 or lower Flower Cardian monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. Also, you cannot normal or special summon monsters for the rest of the turn except for Flower Cardians. When this card is targeted for an attack, you can negate that attack, end the battle phase, then draw 1 card. This card feels like it works pretty well for being a main deck boss monster, and so I have 3 copies of this one just to keep the ball kind of rolling. 3 copies of Willow with Calligrapher. Cannot be normal summoned set, must first be special summoned from your hand by attributing 1 level 11 Flower Cardian except Willow with Calligrapher. If this card is special summoned, draw 1 card, and if you do, show it, then you can special summon it if it is a Flower Cardian monster. Otherwise, send it to the graveyard. When this card is used as synchro material, you can treat it and all other synchro materials that have a level as level 2 monsters. Now, unfortunately, Willow with Calligrapher is one of the 2 tuners in the entire archetype, so that might make it a little harder to synchro summon, but we'll take a look at that when we get into gameplay. Let's move on. 3 copies of Flower Cardian Willow. While you control a level 10 or lower Flower Cardian monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. Also, you cannot normal or special summon monsters for the rest of this turn except Flower Cardians. Once per turn, you can target 1 Flower Cardian in your graveyard, shuffle it into your deck, then draw 1 card. 2 copies of Maple with Deer. Cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand by attributing 1 Flower Cardian monster except for Maple with Deer. If this card is special summoned, draw 1 card. If you do, show it. If it's a Flower Cardian monster, you can destroy a spell or trap your opponent controls, otherwise send it to the graveyard. 2 copies of Zebra Grass. While you control a level 7 or lower Flower Cardian monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. Also, you cannot normal or special summon for the rest of this turn except for Flower Cardian monsters. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can reveal any number of Flower Cardian monsters in your hand, shuffle them into the deck, then draw the same number of cards. Zebra Grass feels like a good way to wheel yourself into getting a tiny bit of a better hand if you have enough cards in your hand, which with this deck, you should. 2 copies of Clover with Boar. Cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand by attributing 1 Flower Cardian monster except for Clover with Boar. If this card is special summoned, draw 1 card, and if you do, show it. If it's a Flower Cardian monster, destroy 1 monster your opponent controls, otherwise send it to the graveyard. So now, there we have it, the 2 resident removal cards in the entire deck. 3 copies of Peony with Butterfly. Cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand by attributing 1 Flower Cardian monster except Peony with Butterfly. If this card is special summoned, draw 1 card, and if you do, show it. If it is a Flower Cardian monster, look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck, then place them all on the top or the bottom of the deck in any order. Otherwise, send it to the graveyard. When this card is used as synchro material, you can treat it and all other synchro materials that have a level as level 2 monsters. There we have our second tuner. As you can see, I placed 3 copies of both tuners in the deck just to try and get them a little more consistently into our hand so that we could hopefully more consistently bring out our synchro monsters. 3 copies of Cherry Blossom with Curtain. Cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned by its own effect. You can reveal this card in your hand, draw 1 card. If you do, show it, then special summon this card if the drawn card is a Flower Cardian monster. Otherwise, send it and this card to the graveyard. During either player's damage step, when your Flower Cardian monster battles an opponent's monster, you can discard this card. Your battling monster gains 1000 attack until end of turn. I have this card at 3 more so for its first effect rather than its second, wherein it can become a special summon and you don't have to use up your normal summon for this card. However, you do also get that second effect in case you need that slight boost in attack for one of your monsters. 3 copies of Cherry Blossom. If you control a level 2 or lower Flower Cardian monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. Also, you cannot normal or special summon monsters for the rest of this turn except Flower Cardians. Once per turn, you contribute 1 Flower Cardian monster, draw 1 card. If you do show it, if it's a Flower Cardian, you can take 1 Flower Cardian monster from your deck except Cherry Blossom and either add it to your hand or special summon it. Otherwise, send the card you drew to the graveyard. I feel like this one's self-explanatory, but since all of these cards are just word salad, it's getting a card into your hand or simply special summoning a card for free. 3 copies of Pine with Crane, cannot be normal summoned or set, must first be special summoned from your hand by distributing 1 level 1 Flower Cardian except for Pine with Crane. If this card is special summoned, draw 1 card, and if you do show it, then you can special summon it if it is a Flower Cardian monster, otherwise send it to the graveyard. At the end of the battle phase, if this card battled, draw 1 card. Lastly, for monsters, 2 copies of Pine. If this card is normal summon, draw 1 card, show it, then send it to the graveyard unless it is a Flower Cardian monster. You can only use this effect of Flower Cardian Pine once per turn. If this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, or if this card in your possession is destroyed by an opponent's card effect and sent to your graveyard, you can draw 1 card. I initially have this card at 2 simply because of its second effect, because its second effect might happen, it might not happen, although I will admit that I did neglect to remember about the first effect, the normal summon effect, and so that is my fault. This card should be at 3, however, we're going to leave it at 2 for this. Moving on to Spell and Traps, we've got 1 copy of Flower Gathering. Special summon 4 Flower Cardian monsters with 100 attack and different names from your deck in attack position, but they have their effects negated. Also, they cannot be tributed for Tribute Summon. You can only activate 1 Flower Gathering per turn. You cannot normal or special summon other monsters during the turn you activate this card except Flower Cardians. Now, I have this card at 1 simply because there are not that many 100 attack Flower Cardians, and even if there were, as of right now, none of them are the tuners of the deck. I can see no specific reason to bring out 4 differently named 100 attack Flower Cardians and negate their effects unless you were using Xyz monsters or Link monsters in this deck, and even then, most likely this would pretty much only be good for Link monsters as far as I can tell, especially since they need to be different names. However, if you're going to be super purist about this deck, if you just want the Flower Cardians, this card is not going to be super great for you, but I do think it still can be included in the deck. Moving on, 2 copies of Flower Stacking. Choose 3 Flower Cardian monsters with different names in your deck. Place them on top of your deck in any order. During your main phase, except the turn this card was sent to the graveyard, you can banish this card from your graveyard, then target 1 Flower Cardian monster in your graveyard, add it to your hand. You can only use this effect once per turn. 2 copies of Reincarnation. Target 1 Flower Cardian monster in your graveyard, add it to your hand, then you can special summon 1 Flower Cardian monster from your hand, ignoring its summoning conditions. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a Flower Cardian monster's effect, you can excavate the top 5 cards of your deck. If you do, add 1 excavated spell trap card to your hand. Place the remaining cards on top of your deck in any order. 2 copies of Super All-In. Return 1 Synchro monster you control to the extra deck. If you do, special summon 4 Flower Cardians from your graveyard, then draw 1 card, show it, and if it is a Flower Cardian, you get to special summon it, ignoring its summoning conditions. Otherwise, destroy as many monsters you control as possible, and if you destroyed at least 1, halve your life points. During the end phase, if this card is in the graveyard because it was sent there by the effect of a Flower Cardian while this card was in your possession, you can add 1 spell trap from your graveyard to your hand. I have this card at 2 because I personally feel like it works like a better defusion. Of course, it does have the gigantic downside that if you do not draw into a monster, all of your monsters get disappeared and you lose half your life points. Although I feel like if you run this deck properly, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. Lastly, for spells, 3 copies of Super Koi Koi. Excavate the top 3 cards of your deck and special summon as many Flower Cardian monsters among them as possible, ignoring their summoning conditions, but their levels become 2 and they have their effects negated. Banish the remaining cards face down, and if you do, lose 1,000 life points for each. You can banish this card from your graveyard and tribute 1 monster, special summon 1 Flower Cardian monster from your hand, ignoring its summoning conditions. You can only activate 1 Super Koi Koi per turn. This card has a lot of utility to it in my mind, and I feel like this card is just a banger of a spell for this deck. Lastly, for the main deck, we have the only trap, Fraud Freeze, a continuous trap card. Once per turn, when your opponent special summons a monster from the hand except during the damage step, you can return to hand all monsters your opponent controls that were special summoned from the hand. If neither player controls a Flower Cardian Synchro monster, send this card to the graveyard. This card's okay for it being a trap card. The one downside of this card, and it's a pretty big downside looking at the deck blank here, is that it requires a Synchro monster out. If you can't get that Synchro monster out, or if your opponent happens to get rid of your Synchro monster, if they stop you from Synchro summoning, you might be a little bit messed up in this deck. But I figure with a pure archetype, if I'm trying not to go anything else, I can include this if it's at 1. Alright, moving on to our extra deck monsters. We've got 3 copies of Flower Cardian Light Flare. It requires 1 tuner and 4 non-tuners. Once per turn, during either player's turn, when your opponent activates a spell or trap card, you can negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. If a Flower Cardian you control battles an opponent's monster, that opponent's monster has its effects negated during the battle phase only. If this face-up Synchro Summon card is destroyed by battle or leaves the field because of an opponent's card effect while its owner controls it, you can special summon 1 Flower Cardian Synchro monster from your extra deck except Light Flare. Light Flare has a lot going on for it, and it is definitely the boss monster coming out of the extra deck for this deck, as far as I can see. You get free spell trap negation, you get free negation of monster effects during the battle phase, and you get a free extra deck summon when this card leaves the field by an opponent's card. I feel like it is a good, well-rounded card, but I need to know that we can get it out consistently. And it's a 5,000 attack monster. Who doesn't want a 5,000 attack beater? 3 copies of Light Shower, requires 1 tuner and 3 non-tuners. Your opponent cannot target Flower Cardian monsters you control with card effects. Also, those monsters cannot be destroyed by card effects. During your opponent's draw phase, if they draw a card for their normal draw, inflict 1,500 damage to your opponent. Once per turn during your opponent's end phase, activate one of these effects, skip the draw phase of your next turn, or this card has its other effects negated until your opponent's next standby phase. 2 copies of Borderfly, 1 tuner and 2 non-tuners. If a Flower Cardian monster you control attacks a defense position monster, inflict piercing battle damage to your opponent. Once per turn, you can banish 1 Flower Cardian from your graveyard. Until the end of your opponent's next turn, they cannot activate effects of cards in the graveyard. Also, they cannot special summon from the graveyard. And lastly, for the deck as a whole, we have 2 copies of Moonflower Viewing, a 1 tuner and 2 non-tuner requirement. Once per turn during your main phase, you can draw 1 card. If you do, show it. If it's a Flower Cardian, special summon it, ignoring its summoning conditions, and it can attack directly this turn. If you activated this effect, skip the draw phase of your next turn. When this card is used to Synchro Material, you can treat it and all other Synchro Materials that have a level as level 2 monsters. Moonflower Viewing acts as our only other tuner in the archetype, and it is not part of the main deck. It is in the extra deck, so you do have to get it out first in order to use its effect to get out other things. You might have noticed, if my word salad wasn't too droning, that a couple of these cards skip your draw phase, which shouldn't be a big problem since every Flower Cardian card in the main deck allows you to draw during some point in time in your turn. Now that we have that, let's go ahead, take a look at some gameplay, and then we'll come right back for our evaluation of the archetype and of the deck. Starting us off in our first hand, it looks like we don't have that bad of a hand here. We can start with our Flower Gathering, gathering some cards from our deck. Of course, once we have those cards out, we can go ahead and summon any of the cards from our hand, activating their effects. For example, we can tribute our Pine for our Pine with Crane. Once our Crane comes out, we can go ahead, draw a card. We reveal that new card to our opponent, and since it is a Flower Cardian monster, we can special summon it. Luckily for us, the card we got was our Palona, so if it gets targeted for an attack, we can negate the attack. Since we're going first, we can also get rid of our Zebragrass for our Peony with Butterfly. Our Peony with Butterfly comes out on our first turn, we can draw a card. Unluckily for us, this card is not a Flower Cardian monster, but if it were, we could go ahead and rearrange our opponent's deck, but that's okay, that's not the end of our turn, of course. But since we do have flower stacking in our hand, we can go ahead and activate it if we'd like and get 3 Flower Cardians of any that we choose on the top of our deck. But since our zones are filled here, we might want to hold off on that. Because the other two monsters in our hand are our removal monsters, we do want to wait on them for now. However, we can use these 4 cards on our side of the field, ignoring our Paulownia here, to go ahead and synchro summon for our Light Shower. And of course, when Light Shower's out on the field, when our opponent draws for their first turn, they do have to take damage in order to get that done. From here, moving into our second turn, we can end our opponent's turn, skipping our draw phase, and we can still do whatever we need to with the cards that we have in our hand. This would, of course, be the point in time where we would activate flower stacking to make sure that we have everything on the top of the deck that we need for the rest of the turn. Whether or not we drew a card from Paulownia, we can still use both of our removal cards right here in our hand. So overall, I think this deck can have a really strong first turn, whether you're going first or second, at least in my opinion, depending on how you draw. So now that we've seen how the deck plays, how do we feel about the archetype as a whole and about this deck that I've built here? Personally, for me, I feel like this archetype is super strong. I've had people play this archetype against me before, and they wreck me every single time, and I never know what to do. This archetype, in my opinion, seems to just get around negates somehow, just constantly. Unless I have already set up a bunch of Omni Negates on my field, this deck just gets around it all the time, as far as I'm concerned. It seems like a good foil to this deck would be to have Apollousa out. This deck also seems to die to Droll and Lockbird, of course. If I were building this deck, I might try to take out our Fraud Freeze and maybe a few of our other spell cards here. Keep in my Flower Stacking, keep in my Super Koi Koi, keep in my Flower Gathering. Maybe add some more cards to the extra deck and put in some Pot of Extravagance. However, personally speaking, I feel like this deck is a pretty strong deck and can stand pretty well on its own as far as I've seen. For the archetype itself, I do think it could use a little bit of help with maybe 1 or 2 more tuners. However, given what I just saw in the gameplay, it seems like this deck can just hold its own even if you don't draw a tuner on your first turn. Again, there is something to be said about maybe putting Pine at 3 and taking away another from a different card in the main deck, maybe even putting Flower Gathering at 2, given how strong it made my first hand in this gameplay. But overall, I like the deck, and if you would like to play a strong deck and you're just playing casually and you're a beginner, I feel like this is a good deck to go with. Just ensure that you're paying attention to all the draws and everything that you get to do during your turn. Those are my thoughts on the deck. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that this video was at least a little bit enjoyable to you, and until next time, drink your water.